Hello and welcome to MASHmouth, a podcast covering every single episode of the hit 1970s sitcom MASH. I'm Ethan.
And I'm Vanessa.
So, Vanessa, no offense to anyone who loves this episode, but you and I are not very hot on it, and we're not particularly cold on it either. We're just kind of in the middle of it being like, fine.
Lukewarm, if you will.
Yeah. And that puts us in a weird position of people who have to talk about this for roughly half an hour in a podcast format. Because, you know, this show is not designed for every episode to be talked about and discussed at length. Some episodes are just supposed to be like, well, that was an episode of television. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to talk about how TV shows nowadays are kind of constructed with podcasts and like blogs in mind. You gotta get the internet discussion going. When you watch anything major kind of on TV nowadays, do you have any places you go to like check out like discussion of the episode? Do you follow any like fan stuff?
Not really. I mostly talk to you about it, honestly. I talk to my friends about it, who I know I can nerd out to. And that's kind of it. I do watch a lot of video essay commentary kind of things. And you saying that kind of reminded me of this one video by this creator, Sarah Z. She talked about how streaming is kind of almost ruining TV. She doesn't make a hard stance on it, but how it's changed TV a lot. And how, like you said, it almost is meant for that kind of like extra media discussion about each episode and how each episode is meant to make you click on the next one rather than be an overarching story. So that's really interesting that you bring that up.
I like Sarah Z as well. She's probably one of my favorite like YouTube people. Mm-hmm. And like I'm always impressed by her videos because it's literally just her sitting on a couch and just talking at a camera. I'm like, wow, wish I was that entertaining that I could just do that for an hour and a half and people would watch. But yeah, I know what you're saying with, you know, streaming. They're not constructing like full episodes rather than like just trying to get you to go from the next one to the next one to the next one. And TV's in a really interesting place right now because, you know, there's always been like water cooler discussion, like people who liked, you know, whatever show they're going to talk about with their friends. But like it's so kind of like corporatized now of like there's after shows where like people talk about like Walking Dead and like Breaking Bad when that was on and like Better Call. Basically every AMC show has a has an after show, weirdly. But even like more comedic stuff like the show What We Do in the Shadows like has a legitimate like after show that's online. I'm like, this is just a comedy. It doesn't need a professionally produced like stars talking about what they did for the episode. It's just very odd now.
I don't typically watch after shows like that unless there's an episode where I'm like really, really interested. But I also think that like you and I are both interested in like writing and the productions of shows. I think that those kind of TV shows, this is a little bit off topic, but the kind of TV shows where it's like the writer's room and like the creators of the show and the writers of the show are talking about their process and like what they're thinking and going into it. And even that, it's like, it's almost meant for other commentary too. Like, you know, of course we do this podcast, right? About like the writer's intentions about stuff and like characterization and whatnot. And like even having that behind the scenes is want for more discussion about like digging deeper into the media that you're discussing.
Yeah, I don't really know what like conclusion to bring to this. What I just kind of thought about this as like an interesting talking point, but it's something that, I mean, we do a rewatch podcast. Granted, we do a show that's like very old and like not in the conversation. I know people still love MASH, but it's like not
it's not like a hot button show. Yeah.
On one hand, like I like this kind of stuff. I like people talking about shows I like engaging in that discussion. But it is kind of like interesting now that like shows are produced with the intention of, well, we have to give people online something to clickbait people with.
Yeah, definitely. I think that we should link this Sarah Z video because she talks about, and not all of these topics, but a lot of these topics at length, and it's a really well done video.
Yeah, shout out to Sarah Z. May she never find this because she's a giant creator. So anyway, this episode is called Officers Only, and when Hawkeye and Trapper operate on a general's son, they are rewarded with a trip to Tokyo, and the camp is given a brand new officers club. Hawkeye and Trap don't think that this is fair, so they scheme to let in other enlisted personnel. So, I know what you kind of generally think about this one, but what are your thoughts on this episode?
This definitely wasn't a favorite of mine. It was kind of just like there in this season. It definitely wasn't bad, I don't think. I just didn't particularly have any strong feelings about it. Although I will say, because I've seen all the show, right? The Officers Club is like a long withstanding thing. Like, it's not something that... Yeah, it's not something that just kind of goes away after this episode or is like specific to just this episode. The Officers Club stays throughout the rest of the entire series. So it's nice to kind of look back on this origin of the Officers Club that's just like a staple in the rest of the series. So I really liked that aspect. The rest of the episode I wasn't like really hot on. Again, like more lukewarm than really cold on it. But yeah, I liked the introduction of the Officers Club, but not much else about the episode, I don't think.
That was my number one question about the episode, was whether or not the Officers Club carried on. Because, you know, with this kind of show, you never know what's like picked up in terms of like continuity and what isn't. There's a lot of elements that like can just be discarded because, you know, this is just an episode of television. They weren't like anticipating people like dissecting this like, you know, making fan theories and fan fiction and stuff like that. So, you know, you introduce an Officers Club for an episode and you're like, well, that was an episode and goodbye. I like that they carried that over. That kind of brains the episode a little bit more. That's the origin story of this recurring thing rather than an isolated thing. I thought that this episode was straight down the middle fine. Like, there was nothing offensive or bad about it, but, you know, God forbid that a sitcom doesn't give you something to talk about for roughly half an hour. It was just like, yep, this is an episode of MASH, and it's a pretty alright one.
Yeah, this is definitely, like, for me, just, like, a background episode. I would definitely not consider it, like, a favorite, like I said, but it's definitely not one I would turn off. I don't think I'd turn off any episode of MASH, honestly, but this is one that I'd, like, pay less attention to as it kind of goes on in the background. Do you want to get into, I guess, like, more of the plot of the episode? It was a pretty loose plot. I felt like it really went by pretty quickly.
Definitely. First, Trapper has to, like, wake up Hawkeye, so he sends a radar to do it. And, you know, Hawkeye's, like, sleeping at the other side of the bed. And it's, like, a funny bit. But, again, it didn't, like, stand out.
Mm-hmm.
But then, you know, they discover that the kid that they're operating on is the son of this general. So they have to take it, like, more seriously than I guess they tend to, even though they take everyone seriously because they're good doctors. But, you know, this guy has a pedigree to him.
That's one thing that I hated about this episode. Not hated, but like I hated Frank in this episode a lot because when Hawkeye and Trapper are operating on this kid, like Hawkeye is operating, Trapper's assisting, and Frank and Margaret just like walk in scrubbed up in surgical whites. They're like, okay, like we're ready to take over. We're higher ranking officers and we should be operating on this private who is the son of a general, more so than two captains should be. And it's just like, I hate you, Frank. And also like low-key Margaret here too, but like more so Frank, because it's just like, okay, so this kid's life like means more than another private's life. Like, would he have wanted to assist on just like anyone? No, of course not.
He would not have.
And that's not to say this kid's life wasn't important, but like, screw you, Frank. I was so mad at this one scene I was watching. I was just scribbling my notes like so angrily.
That's really funny. This is another one of like Frank's vie for power kind of things. Even the Officers Club throughout the episode, he's kind of like holding it over that like he got this and it's exclusive. Ooh la la.
Yeah.
But yeah, I feel you with Frank and Margaret kind of coming in trying to goof up this surgery. I was like, y'all, they're already like in the process. You can't honestly expect like Trapper to be like, yeah, okay.
Yeah, I can imagine medically also that would be very like dangerous. Like Trapper's hands are already in there. Why contaminate this, like, body even more? You know what I mean?
Or even beyond that, like, just, like, rhythmically? Just, like, as work partners, you know, Trapper and Hawkeye kind of know each other's, like, rhythms.
Yeah.
So switching out with Frank or Margaret, I guess, like, would screw up Hawkeye, wouldn't it? Like, that would not be good for the kid.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. I do have to mention, right after this, when the general comes, kind of the whole crux of the episode, he's, like, very happy with the work that the doctors did. This is the same general as the one who was at Henry's hearing. So Henry is very much, like, on edge, it seems. I don't know if that was intentional or not, but it, like, in my mind, in continuity-wise, it's very funny to be like, oh, this is the guy that was gonna potentially have Henry brought up on charges of treason. So I could understand why Henry was, like, very on edge here.
Yeah. I mean, I noticed it was the same guy. I wasn't thinking the connection with the trial episode. I was like, oh yeah, he's just, like, the general now. He's kind of the Clayton of, like, this era of the show for the moment. So, the whole episode, I was just like, why are they being so respectful to this general? I know that it's a general, but it's not like they haven't, like, hung out with the general before. That was, like, my line of thinking, but, like, you know, this being the general that wanted to put Henry on trial, or, you know, was at his hearing, rather, that kind of does clarify why at least Henry was so, like, enamored with him, I guess. What's the word?
Yeah, I thought it was just really funny that the general shows up and Henry's just, like, desperately trying to pull up his pants in this entire scene between the general and Henry in his tent. That was really funny. And the general, like, kind of has more of, like, a blasé attitude about it, while Henry is, like, super on edge. So I thought that played very well.
I mean, as always, you know, the general sees Klinger up to his shenanigans, and this time Klinger's, like, trying to pretend like he thinks he's pregnant.
Yeah.
And I thought that whole bit was, like, so weird, but, like, really good. Because, again, it's the way people react to him is, like, what makes these work. Of, like, what does he say? Henry's like, I need those pillows so your pregnancy's over. It's so silly.
It was very funny. Just, like, the visual of Klinger in this skirt and just pregnant with, like, this big, like, pretend pregnant belly was very, very funny.
And even Radar comes in and immediately is like, oh, congratulations. Like, if I saw that, I wouldn't think that, like, he was pregnant.
I know. I really do love how Radar is just, he's very, with Klinger, he's very just, like, kind of run-of-the-mill with it. Like, it's almost as if he believes that Klinger's a woman a lot of the times. It's very, very funny.
I love my boy, Radar. So they operate on this kid, right? And, you know, the general's very, very thankful because it's, you know, it's his son, blah, blah, blah. So he gives Hawkeye and Trapper a 3-day trip to Tokyo, which I thought it was an interesting decision that we don't ever see them in Tokyo. We hear stories of, like, what they were up to and how they got up to all these, like, shenanigans and kind of, like, ruining the hotel that they were staying at, like, all these, like, weird things. But it's all stories. Like, I think the episode would be better if, like, the B plot was them in Tokyo and we got to see this, like, funny stuff.
This was why I wasn't, like, super hot on this episode, because it felt, like, kind of disjointed, this, like, middle piece of Hawkeye and Trapper kind of wreaking havoc all over Tokyo, like, just really living it up. And then Henry on the phone having to, like, kind of pick up the pieces after them and placate these people who, you know, were basically accosted by Hawkeye and Trapper's bad behavior. But, like, yeah, it just, like, it didn't make much sense in the context of the episode, I feel. So, yeah, it felt like filler almost, I think.
I think this definitely was, like, oh, we have 5 minutes to fill in the episode. Instead of going out and filming all these funny things, let's just say that they happened, and that'll be good enough.
So, Hawkeye and Trapper come back from that weekend in Tokyo to this officers club, and they're like, oh, that's cool, whatever. And then they see this sign being put up that says officers only, so, like, no enlisted men are allowed in. And I liked this scene right after they get back, where they're in the mess tent and all the enlisted personnel who you kind of get the sense that they're like friends with Hawkeye and Trapper, that they're like kind of icing them out. They're like acting like really, really professional with them and like, you know, standing at attention when they come into the room because they're officers and stuff like that. I know that you have thoughts on this, so what did you think about this whole thing?
So the conflict of this episode becomes, as soon as they put the sign up, Hawkeye and Trapper are like, oh, that's not fair. So, like, the episode is them trying to get this to, like, be more open. And yes, we have this one scene with Radar in the mess tent where he's kind of leading this, like, quiet protest of, like, saying, like, this is for enlisted people only, and, like, treating them more like superiors than they tend to. But I think beyond this scene, we didn't really get much of a sense that, like, the enlisted men, like, were upset about this. It wasn't, like, a running thing throughout the rest of the episode. It was this one instance, and then they're like, oh, well, we have to fix this. I, like, watching this episode, didn't get a feeling that this was, like, much of a big deal. Like, I understood, like, why they were trying to do this, but I didn't feel like the drive in it. It was just kind of like, oh, well, okay, they're kind of upset, and we'll make it up to them. More than, like, this is a thing that we have to fix, we have to do it now, we have to, like, get it right. And even, like, how they approach trying to open up the club, like, they talk to Frank and Margaret about it. I'm like, in what world would Frank and Margaret be willing to open up this officers club to them?
Yeah, it really lacked a sense of urgency that this was something that they really had to fix, other than the fact that, like, Trapper and Hawkeye are just, like, good people and they believe in equality. They don't believe in, like, the hierarchy of the military very much. It's very clear. We actually had one of our listeners, Joe, we mentioned last episode. He wrote in...
Shout out to Joe.
Shout out to Joe. He wrote in about this episode, and he said that he really enjoyed this episode, and he liked how the enlisted men were icing Hawkeye and Trapper out, because in his experience in the Navy, enlisted men aren't treated as well as they should, like equally as officers. So I think that this kind of conflict makes a lot of sense in context, like that the enlisted men would feel some kind of way about it, especially in the 4077, where they're in very close quarters with each other. They have to work as a team. But I think that the writing could have been, instead of this like kind of 5-minute thing with Hawkeye and Trapper kind of wreaking havoc all over Tokyo, they could have drawn this out a little bit more to make it more urgent that the enlisted men are really upset about this and they have to fix it.
Yeah, this episode, now that I think about it, has kind of a tell don't show problem where they're telling you that, you know, the officers are upset. They tell us about this like Tokyo trip, but we don't see any of it. They don't show it. And like obviously it's like in context, it is 100% like justifiable and like understandable, and even talking about it, like it makes total sense why this is a conflict. But like watching the episode, I personally didn't get invested in this being like a real issue. So if we like saw more of it, if they like demonstrated that more than just this one scene with Radar in the mess tent, I think it would have like worked a lot better. Because at first I was a little confused. I'm not super familiar with their like ranks and everything. I'll be honest. I wasn't sure if officers only excluded Hawkeye and Trapper. So, like, that was why they were like, we want to get into this club. We're being discriminated against. But, like, they could go in at any time. Like, forgive me for being an idiot. I don't know, like, military hierarchy. I'm sure everyone listening to this was like, wow, this guy's, like, a moron. He's got, like, the brain of a wet sponge.
No, the only reason that I really understand military rank is because I did extensive research on military like hierarchy in my like years of watching this show, because I really wanted to understand.
Well, I'm glad that this was not immediately obvious to you as a child watching it.
It definitely makes sense when you know. But yeah, no, I understand why you'd kind of be confused about that as well. So after this scene, like you said, they talk to Frank and Margaret about it, and it just kind of like doesn't go well. And even in that first scene where Hawkeye and Trapper return from Tokyo and they see the officers only sign, and Frank has this just like sneer, like this smirk on his face, like he's so happy. He's such an elitist shithead, I said, because he has this like smirk on his face and he's so happy the enlisted men who carry his ass a lot of the time, like he could not deal with being in the army without these enlisted personnel. Like, he's so happy that they're excluded. And that just made me even angrier. And of course, like, Margaret also said, she's like, I'm not signing this piece of paper that says that we're opening the club up to the enlisted personnel either. And I was like, what is wrong with you guys? Like, is it so bad? I hated that whole thing.
Yeah, you know, Frank is always elitist. And, like, this is one where you really see that he is kind of a discriminating person. And it's kind of gross. Like, I didn't like Frank or Margaret in this one. Like, I didn't like how they even treated the bartender. I could, like, tell that, like, Frank was, like, looking down on him, like, more than he probably should have. I was like, I don't like that. But I did think it was funny that Frank was drinking Shirley Temples and also getting drunk off of them.
Okay, but, like, I know that we both don't drink, but I've had, like, virgin Shirley Temples before, and they're good. So I don't see why Hawkeye and Trapper were being so, so snobbish about their alcohol. But I guess it's, like, not, like, a manly man drink. Yeah, I guess so. But we also find out, like you said, it seemed like Frank was, like, looking down on this bartender. And we find out that, of course, Frank is, like, a really bad tipper. He tips the guy 5% of the bill. It's just like, okay, dude, what is that, 25 cents? Like, get out of here.
He tips him 5% and he puts it on his tab. So he's not paying him either way. I'm like, what is this? Is bad person right here.
Yeah, didn't like this. So there's multiple scenes in the Officers Club, but I think like we're winding down at this point to get to one of the final scenes. And of course, so the general comes and he is very much willing to have a drink at the Officers Club to like celebrate and whatnot. And then his son walks in, who is a private, and Hawkeye and Trapper are immediately like, oh, no, like, you know, your son can't join you for a drink because he's an enlisted man. And so I felt like the general was kind of a good sport about it. He was just like, no, yeah, you're right. Like, that's the rules. Mm-hmm. But then he asked Henry, like, hey, like, what do you think about this? Like, this is your outfit. You make the call, basically. So then the workaround, of course, to allowing the enlisted personnel to be able to enter and drink at the Officers Club is that there's this family exception. Like, if you're related to an officer, you can come drink even if you're an enlisted man. And, of course, then Hawkeye just, like, kind of brings everybody in. Is like, oh, this is my brother-in-law. This person, like, Radar is like a son to me. Klinger is like a daughter to me. My cousin, my second cousin, like, all that kind of stuff. So, of course, they get their way at the end. Of course, like, equality is supreme. And it was a very, like, sweet, wholesome type of ending for this episode.
Yeah. For as much as we're like, this is fine, like, this episode is literally just fine. Like, the fact that the general just immediately kind of gives in and there's no real conflict there. It was just like, oh, okay, that wasn't a big deal after all. That's fine. But I did like the solution that Hawkeye came up with. It was, like, really cute and really, like, in character of him to be like, oh, this is my cousin so-and-so and my Aunt Shirley and blah, blah, blah. It's like, you know, just these, like, funny him being very over the top about it. And everyone else being like, yeah, that's fine. This is just him being a goofball. So, you know, again, straight down the middle, like, perfectly fine. Nothing wrong with this episode, but it wasn't exceptional. And it wasn't bad. And this ending is like the definition of like, well, that worked itself out, didn't it?
Yeah.
One thing that I want to say about the Officers Club, when they're trying to get more people in, Hawkeye talks to Henry about it. And he's like, oh, it's beautiful. They prefabricated. It just popped up in 2 hours. It has a jukebox, blah, blah, blah. It can double as a church on Sunday. And that just reminded me of, like, the episode where they're trying to get an incubator. And I'm like, wow, you can get all this so easily. But, like, actual medical equipment is, like, impossible. And you had to, like, work your way up through the channels to get that. It's like, yeah, that's great. That adds to that episode's commentary, honestly.
Yeah, like, this general can snap his fingers and they have a drinking establishment in like 2 hours, but to get life-saving medical equipment, it's just like, no, it's not necessary. Sorry, guys.
Maybe that's a bit of a downer to kind of end this discussion on, but it was something that was like nagging me in the back of my mind throughout the episode.
No, yeah, it's absolutely true.
That like they could get this like funny haha thing, but the second that they like need something, it's a whole ordeal. So, Vanessa, now that we're kind of ending our discussion of the episode, because there's not much more to say, like, things work out, you know? That's pretty much the end.
Yeah.
Do you have any trivia for us?
I do have some trivia about the bartender. So this actor's name, and I apologize if I mess this up, is Clyde Kosastu, and he played Kwang Duk, who was the bartender. This man has 310 acting credits on IMDb. Isn't that crazy? So I'm going to go through it, like, just a couple of them, because obviously can't go through all of them. He guest starred in just about every show that you can think of in, like, the 70s and 80s. Some of his older works include the original Hawaii Five-0, All in the Family, and Taxi. He is another guest star on Trapper John MD. So where is that show? Like, we need to watch it, because so many guest stars from MASH were on it. So anyway, back to this actor. He also had recurring roles in Family Matters, Star Trek The Next Generation, and soap operas like The Bold and the Beautiful, The Young and the Restless, and General Hospital. And he's done a ton of voice acting work, like a lot of kids' cartoons. So many that I can't name all of them, but a lot on like Cartoon Network, like The Grim Adventures of Billy and Mandy, of course, which we love here. His most recent works include a guest spot on an episode of this show, Designated Survivor.
Oh.
Didn't that have Kiefer Sutherland?
That is Kiefer Sutherland in it, who's Don Sutherland's son.
Who played Hawkeye in the MASH movie.
It's all full circle if you think about it.
He also has a role in this upcoming movie called Sight, which is currently being filmed. So this man is actually still alive. So I thought that was really cool. Like, he is a very, very prolific actor.
That rules. Now that you say that he's a voice actor, it kind of makes sense why he has 300 credits. That's usually what it is. It's like, well, voice acting you can do a lot of very quickly. Moving on from that, do you have any favorite lines of this episode?
I do. There's not like too many that I really thought stuck out to me. So the one that I really thought was funny was when Radar and the other enlisted men were kind of giving Trapper and Hawkeye the cold shoulder, and Hawkeye says, "Radar, it's us, your aunt and uncle." I don't know. I thought that was very funny.
That's like a classic Hawkeye to me.
And then there was this other one where they were trying to get Frank to sign the petition to allow the enlisted men in the officers club. And I think it was Trapper that said Frank wouldn't sign his own stay of execution, which I thought that was very, very clever.
No, this episode is still very solid. One line that stuck out to me was that it was just kind of weird that apparently while they were in Tokyo, Trapper and Hawkeye, like, sent a general, I think it was MacArthur, like, a very high-ranking general, pipe cleaners, and I'm like, what does that mean? Why is that, like, a big deal? I don't understand that.
That was funny, because it was also like, why would they do that? Like, I think that it was just like, oh, they were just being weird.
I think so. And they do, like, clarify later on that, like, oh, they meant to send it to, like, a woman. And I'm like, why would a woman want pipe clean? I don't understand this. But, you know, maybe that's me being too unfamiliar with pipe culture. I assume it's a smoking pipe, not like a literal... not like the pipe cleaners that you use for arts and crafts in school.
You know, it's so funny because I literally didn't even think about that. I was just like, why would they send like fuzzy pipe cleaners to General MacArthur? Oh my god, that is so funny. I didn't even think like smoking pipes. Wow, okay. Who can tell that we're very young?
It's not that we're very young, we're very boring. We don't do a lot of like cool things that involve like actual. We don't drink, we don't smoke, we don't do much, so we're unfamiliar with this world.
Okay, Ethan. So I think the only thing left is maybe a controversial topic, but what is your martini rating for this episode?
I give this a straight down the middle 2.5 out of 5. Like, it is the average episode. Okay,
so I was afraid that you were going to give it higher than me, so I originally said 2.5 as well. But, you know, I don't know, because I feel like we gave Dear Dad 3 a higher rating than this, and I definitely wouldn't give Dear Dad 3 a higher rating than this episode. So, I don't know. Maybe I'll change my Dear Dad 3 rating to, like, 2. I think I said 2. I give this one, like, 2.5 as well.
Okay. So, just to wrap up, we'd like to give thanks to Jacob Fierbalka for being our technical consultant, Vanessa's sister, Melissa, for awesome cover art, and, of course, our listeners, especially Joe, for giving us some added context for this episode. Links to our music, social media, and contacts for the show are linked in the description, as always, and join us next week for Season 2, Episode 16, Henry in Love. But until then, send your superior officer some pipe cleaners. Goodbye, farewell, and amen.
Bye, everyone.